Hello, everyone, and thank you for participating in the Lytham Partners 2022 Summer Investor Conference. My name is Joe Diaz. I'm a managing partner at Lytham Partners. For this presentation, we welcome Humanigen, which trades on the Nasdaq exchange under the ticker symbol of HGEN. Representing Humanigen today is Dr. Dale Chappelle, Chief Scientific Officer. Dale and I will engage in a fireside Q&A chat today. We will discuss Humanigen's drug candidate, lenzilumab, which is designed to neutralize the cytokine storm associated with COVID-19 and other indications. We will also bring you up to date on the status of the drug approval process through the NIH and the FDA. Before we begin our discussion, we thank all of you for participating today. Lytham Partners is one of the country's leading investor relations firm. With more than 2 decades of corporate access experience, we've built one of the industry's most diverse and effective platforms for connecting small cap companies with high quality and focused institutional investors. One final item before we begin. The Humanigen team will be available for one-on-one meetings later this week. If you have not already signed up, please visit the Lytham Partners website at lythampartners.com/virtual and click the one-on-one meeting request button. With that said, let me introduce Dr. Dale Chappelle, Chief Scientific Officer of Humanigen. Dale, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having us, Joe.
Appreciate your time. To kick it off here, would you please give us the 30-second elevator pitch on Humanigen and perhaps another 30 seconds on your background, and then we can get into the discussion.
Absolutely. So Humanigen is a monoclonal antibody company. Its core technology is called Humanigen. That's a way of taking antibodies, typically mouse antibodies or murine antibodies, and making them fully human. We have 3 monoclonal antibodies that we're developing. We're going to spend all our time today talking about our lead asset, lenzilumab. That, as you said, that is an antibody that targets or neutralizes a cytokine called GM-CSF. So GM-CSF is an inflammatory cytokine that's involved in a process that we call cytokine storm. Now, cytokine storm, probably the easiest way to understand that is essentially the body overreacting to a foreign threat, whether it's a virus or a bacteria. Your body sees that as foreign, starts to secrete cytokines, and sometimes too much cytokines, such that the inflammatory process runs out of control. That's what cytokine storm is. So we'll spend some time today talking about LENZ and how it addresses cytokine storm. And maybe just on my background then, so I'm a medical doctor by training. I did a postdoc fellowship at the National Institutes of Health. I worked with Steve Rosenberg and Nick Restifo there. And while there, I was studying GM-CSF and published on GM-CSF. After my time at the NIH, I went on to business school and got an MBA and spent most of my career as a buy-side investor, but have been in this role now as the Chief Scientific Officer for Humanigen for just about 2 years now.
Fantastic. Well, great background. And so let's kick things off here. My first question, really from an investment perspective, we're obviously in a pretty long and steep bear market for biotech stocks. It's been one of the longest ones in quite a while. Why should people be interested in Humanigen from an investment perspective at this particular point?
Yeah, well, the biotech sector is driven by data, and particularly good data and late stage data on clinical programs. So, that's where we find ourselves right now with Humanigen. Good late stage data can lead to authorizations, regulatory approvals, commercialization, and sometimes even strategic transactions. All those things can drive stock prices higher, even in a bad bear market, as you've indicated. And, as I said in my introduction, I'm a buy-side investor myself, so certainly can feel the pain and understand what it means to be investing in these types of markets. But the key to outperforming is looking for the kind of near-term catalysts, and late-stage data can be such a catalyst and allow a stock to outperform even in a bad tape. So We have a study, a phase 2/3 study that's sponsored by the National Institutes of Health. It's for hospitalized patients with COVID-19. We're expecting that data to be reading out very soon. Our public guidance is for that data to be, in Q2, which would be, this month.
With regards to that trial, what gives you confidence in the potential for a positive outcome from it?
So we've already announced and have now published a phase 3 study. That was a company-sponsored phase 3 study that involved 520 hospitalized COVID-19 patients. We published that data. That was a positive study. We hit our primary endpoint with statistical significance, and that data is now published in Lancet Respiratory Medicine. So if you look at the outcome of that study, LINS showed the ability to reduce hospitalized patients, their progression to invasive mechanical ventilation and death. And that reduction was a relative reduction of about 33%. We went on and looked at the data even further to try to identify whether there were patients who were deriving even more benefit. And using an inflammatory marker, which almost every hospitalized patient gets, that inflammatory marker is called C-reactive protein. We'll call it CRP as we kind of go along in this fireside chat. But when we look at patients who have a CRP below a certain threshold, and that threshold's 150, we see an even greater benefit to patients treated with linzilimab. And that translates to a 62% relative risk reduction of needing invasive mechanical ventilation or dying in the first month after treatment. And if we look at sort of how that compares to other therapies, and up on the slide here, you can see remdesivir, dexamethasone, tocilizumab, and baricitinib. Now that data all comes from a meta-analysis. So that basically incorporates all the randomized trials that have been conducted to date, looking at those drugs' ability to reduce the need for invasive mechanical ventilation or death. And then on the right, you can see what we observed in the live air study. And that's what we refer to as our phase 3 study. We call it live air. And the overall population, there was a 33% reduction, and of course, a 62% then reduction in what we're calling our target population. The reason we call it the target population, because now that's the group that the NIH is studying. So the NIH looked at this data. They thought that the 62% reduction in the CRP subgroup was compelling, and they decided to advance, the NIH study, which is called ACTIV-5 or BET-B, to a phase 2/3 confirmatory study. Now, sometimes when you look at subgroups, they make up a small fraction of the study, and they're always subject to sampling bias. In this case, our CRP subgroup makes up 78% of the patient population. So this is the large majority of the study population. And again, this is an overall positive study. So this is not some sort of data hacking where you go back and try to figure out where the drug worked because it didn't work in the overall population. This is really trying to maximize the benefit for patients and for payers in the healthcare system. So this is kind of gives us confidence in the upcoming data readout and why we're excited about that study readout.
So that said, what would positive data look like from your ACTIV-5 BET-B study on such a pretty large population? What would that positive data look like?
So the primary endpoint is still focused on reducing invasive mechanical ventilation and death. And again, if you look at the comparators out there and what they were able to do, if we're able to reduce the risk of invasive mechanical ventilation and death by somewhere in the range of 20 to 30% above standard of care, we think that that's clinically meaningful. Just to put some context around a 20 to 30% reduction of invasive mechanical ventilation and death, based on current hospitalization trends in the US, that would translate over an annualized period to somewhere in the range of 40 to 100,000 fewer mechanical ventilations or deaths just in the United States. So that's obviously a clear benefit to patients, can improve outcomes, but also can reduce the burden of healthcare systems, both in the US and then in other developed countries as well.
With regards to the commercial opportunity that exists in this market, particularly for patients hospitalized with COVID-19, what is the size of that opportunity? How do you internally see that?
Yeah, so it varies obviously, country by country, but if you look at the two top products for hospitalized patients with COVID-19, they did a combined 7 billion in global sales in 2021. So, that's obviously a huge number. It shows you kind of the size of the market for the hospitalized patients. But the other important point here is that the commercial ramp is very rapid for COVID-19. A typical biopharmaceutical company may spend 5+ years trying to get to, kind of that peak level of sales. And COVID, it's been an extremely rapid adoption. So not only are the authorizations because of the EUA process, very rapid relative to a full BLA, but commercialization is also very rapid as well. So, pending positive data, and if the data from this upcoming NIH study are positive and it leads to an authorization, we would be hopeful for a relatively quick authorization and a relatively rapid commercialization as well. And just as an example, if you look at remdesivir, that was approved under EUA in May of 2020. It received full authorization in October of 2020. And now it's used, essentially, barely a year and a half later to treat over 50% of all hospitalized patients in the US. So it gives you some idea of how quickly, these therapies are adopted into standard of care. Now, if you look at our upcoming NIH study, that's a combination study with remdesivir. So in one arm will be linzilimab plus remdesivir, and the other arm, it's placebo plus remdesivir. So if this study is positive, we see linzilimab being potentially a foundational therapy on which other therapies can be added, including remdesivir. So when you think about kind of the size of the market for remdesivir, that would be potentially the addressable market as well for linzilimab.
With regards to your expectation of receiving results from the Active-5 trial, what is your expectation? When do you think that could possibly happen? And when you do get it, how do you plan to communicate that out there?
So we've fully enrolled the study, and we've announced that publicly. We're currently in the process of doing data cleaning. And it's important to remember this is an NIH study. So NIH is the sponsor of the study. They're responsible for all the data management, data cleaning, and for the data analysis as well. So our public guidance is that we expect to hear top-line data from the NIH in Q2. So it'd be this month. And then we would plan to make that data available publicly by a press release.
Given the evolving COVID pandemic, new variants, also broader vaccine coverage, what do you expect for hospitalizations going forward? And could this change the rate of progression to ventilation or death from the time of the live air trial to Active-5 Bet B?
Yeah, let me take that. I'll split that into two and first address sort of the hospitalizations, and then we'll move on to kind of rates of IMV and death. But, certainly I think we all want the pandemic to end. And I think we've been told that every wave is the last wave for probably a year and a half now. Unfortunately, because of both vaccine and prior infection, that immunity is waning, and we know that it wanes over time. And not only that, the virus continues to evolve at a very rapid clip. So we're starting to see immune escape variants. And because of these two factors, hospitalizations really haven't gone down despite widespread infections and vaccination. So if you look at, we have a slide here in 2020, the first year of the pandemic. Now, this is a partial year. There were 1.3 million hospitalizations in the US. In 2021, there were 2.5 million hospitalizations just in the US. Now, so far in 2022, we've had over 1 million hospitalizations year to date. And if you look at the COVID-19 scenario modeling hub, and this is a group of professional modelers, they're expecting another million hospitalizations for the remainder of the year. So we're expecting 2 million for 2022 and something very similar in 2023. So this is a durable market that's not going away despite high vaccination rates, despite prior infection, because of the increased transmissibility and the virus continuing to mutate. We expect to see millions of hospitalizations in the US essentially for the foreseeable future.
So how does your drug candidate lenzilumab work, and what implications does this have for its potential use in COVID-19 and potentially other indications?
Yeah, Joe, let me just, I think I skipped over the last part of your prior question on IMV and death. So maybe I'll go back and address that, and then I'll jump to the mechanism of action of LENZ.
Perfect.
So when we look at the public data for rates of progression to IMV and death, and this is from June 2020, the first year of the pandemic, all the way through December of 2021. So that's the period that we enrolled our company-sponsored phase 3 live air study, and the period of time where Active 5 was recruiting. There really was no change despite different variants, despite changing standards of care. The rates of progression to IMV and death have been fairly consistent. And we think that that's because, despite widespread vaccination, when you get a breakthrough infection and that results in a hospitalization, at that point in time, it's really the host's inflammatory response, or that harmful inflammatory response, or cytokine storm, that's driving the disease. So prior immunity to the virus doesn't really matter because the virus is not causing the tissue damage. So that's why immunomodulation works best in hospitalized patients, and why prior vaccination and other changes to standard of care really haven't affected rates of progression to IMV and death for that long period of time. And just recently, we saw a trial readout from the NIH. It's called Active 1, another active study. When you look at the mortality rate in that study, and that study enrolled over the period of time that Active 5 enrolled, the mortality rate in the placebo arm of that study was 15%. So that's very similar to the placebo rate that we saw in live air of 14%. So again, despite those trials enrolling over very different time periods, they have very similar mortality rates. So we expect similar rates between live air and Active 5, despite changing variants and vaccinations and changing standard of care.
Sure. So again, with regards to LENZ, let's talk about its implications for COVID-19 and use in other possible indications.
Yeah, so absolutely. So as we talked about it at the very beginning, when we were introducing the company, lenzilumab neutralizes this inflammatory cytokine called GM-CSF. And when we think about GM-CSF, what does it actually do? It activates a specific part of the immune system called myeloid cells. Now, myeloid cells are very important for cytokine storm because they are the cytokine factories, if you want to think about them that way. And GM-CSF is really what drives myeloid cells. So it causes them to be hyperstimulated and to secrete a lot of cytokines. So we kind of talk about GM-CSF being an upstream driver of cytokine storm, and you can see it here on the slide with the arrow pointed to this myeloid cell, or the cytokine factory. It causes this cytokine factory to get ramped up. And then that cytokine factory produces a number of other inflammatory cytokines, such as IL-1 and IL-6. And that's what really then leads to what we think about as cytokine storm. And once we get this overproduction of these inflammatory cytokines, we can get end organ damage. You can get pulmonary damage, for example, or renal damage. And that's what we see in COVID-19. But cytokine storm is not confined to just COVID. Cytokine storm is also a problem in other therapeutic indications. And we have two other indications where we're now at the cusp of starting phase 2 or phase 2/3 studies that are either registrational or potentially registrational. So let me talk to you about the first one there. And that's a study in CAR T. So CAR T is a new form of therapy for hematological cancers. That's leukemias and lymphomas. CAR T is kind of a very new way to treat those leukemias and lymphomas. And right now they're approved for relapse and refractory disease. They're moving into earlier lines of therapy. But these are patients who have very few options, and these therapies are now life-saving. Unfortunately, they come with a risk that the patients can develop life-threatening cytokine storm. So there's a real need to have combination with something like linzilimab that can manage the cytokine storm to reduce the toxicities of these life-saving therapies. So if you look at our non-COVID pipeline here, the SHIELD study is a combination study with 2 approved CAR T therapies. One's Yescarta, the other one's Tescartus. And this is a phase 3 study. The protocol is now approved. We are in the process of site initiation. We plan to be enrolling this study very soon. Another indication where cytokine storm is important and where we see LINZ playing a real role is in acute graft versus host disease, and we refer to that as GVHD. So again, that's a therapy for patients with leukemias or lymphomas. It's a stem cell transplant type of therapy. And because of the stem cell transplant, they develop, again, this harmful inflammatory response or cytokine storm that in this indication is referred to as GVHD. And with linzilimab, we're planning a study to do early treatment of GVHD. This is called the rating study. It's going to be conducted in the UK with a group called the Impact Partnership. Impact is a consortium of transplant centers. So this will be a phase 2-3 study, potentially registrational. Again, we're have an approved protocol. We're very late now in the planning stages and expect to be enrolling patients very soon in this 240 patient study. And maybe the last indication, and this one is a little bit different because this is not a cytokine storm indication. This is an indication called CMML, or chronic myelomonocytic leukemia. These are patients who have a myeloid-driven cancer. And we talked about the myeloid cells being kind of the cytokine factories and GM-CSF being a stimulator of those cells. Well, in patients who have a cancer with particular types of mutations, GM-CSF can act as a growth factor for those cancers. So by neutralizing GM-CSF, you're essentially taking away a growth factor, and that can cause cancer to stop growing. So this is a phase 2-3 study. We already have data from a phase 1 study, but we're now enrolling patients and have already announced we've enrolled several patients in this phase 2-3 study in Australia. And so this is a frontline therapy in combination with azacitidine. We're looking at objective response rates and overall mortality as the endpoints in that study. So that's kind of the overall portfolio for linzilimab.
Sure. With regards to the CAR T and graft versus host disease trials that are out there, what's your thought process in terms of these trials going through the process and finishing up? What's kind of your target for when these things may look toward an approval?
Yeah, so we have regulatory agreements on the trial protocols, both for the CAR T study and the acute GVHD study. We're progressing with patient enrollment. We expect first patient dosed in both of those studies very soon.
Okay, so as it relates to your expectation of data from the NIH Active 5, which you're expecting really in the next month or so, assuming that data is positive, what would Humanigen's next step be to seek regulatory ability to commercialize LENZ for COVID-19? What's the next step?
So our expectations are that within weeks of receiving that top line data from NIH, now remember this is an NIH study, so that data will be coming from NIH. We plan to amend our emergency use authorization with FDA, followed shortly thereafter by a formal response to MHRA. Now it's the UK regulatory authority. So we'll be filing that same data then with MHRA in the UK for a conditional marketing authorization. In terms of our plans for the European Union and their regulatory authority, the EMA, again, we'll use that data package from Active 5 and the Live Air study, so both data packages. And we'll be seeking a conditional marketing authorization there for the EMA for the European Union. And we'll do that under a accelerated assessment process. So with positive data, we think we can have regulatory authorizations and be potentially commercializing, assuming authorization, linzilimab for hospitalized patients with COVID-19 this year. So this could be a very important year and a real value inflection point, for Humanigen, from a late stage biotech company to a true, commercialization footprint.
Well, Dale, we're going to have to leave it there. We thank you very much for your time today. Lots of exciting things on the forefront here for Humanigen, and we greatly appreciate your taking some time and your expertise to share that with us. As a reminder to anyone out there that has not already signed up for one-on-one meetings with Humanigen, please visit the Lytham Partners website at lythampartners.com/virtual and click the one-on-one meeting request button. We hope you enjoy the rest of the conference, and we hope you also have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe.